Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lexpol webinar, Building Resilient Correctional Culture, the Power of Active Bystandership. We're going to be getting started in just a minute or so here. Hey, want to thank our sponsors for today, Heroes. They've been really great partners in getting today's webinar together and producing the content that we have today. So we want to send a special shout out to our sponsors, Heroes, for being here with us today. They've been great partners, so thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to introduce our moderator here for today's webinar. Abigail Tucker is a board-certified police and public safety psychologist and adjunct faculty at CSU Global and Nova Southeastern University. She's also co-founder of Heroes Active Bystandership Training, as well as an experienced clinical leader and forensic psychologist. And at this point, I'm going to turn the floor over to our moderator, Abigail. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Steve. Appreciate it. I'm going to now take a moment to introduce two of our guest speakers. I'm always excited to hear from the field, and we have two correctional leaders with us today. I'm going to start by introducing somebody who I also consider a friend, but I'm eager for you all to learn and hear about her experience in corrections. Lieutenant Colonel Chief of Corrections at the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office, Kathy Fontenot, joins us today. She has a lifelong career in corrections, working in both the Bureau of Prisons, jails, and is a nationally recognized expert, as well as has furthered her degree with her master's in criminal justice. It is no surprise then that she has also been the recipient of several awards in public safety, and I can think of nobody more passionate about resilience for the workforce in corrections. Excited to have you here, Kathy. I'm also joined by Superintendent Christopher Klein. Chris also has a lot of experience in corrections. He rose through the ranks in state prison facilities as well as county facilities, and he is now the superintendent of Anne Arundel County, that is in Maryland, and he is the superintendent over Anne Arundel County detention facilities. I think I've known Chris now for just over 3 years and have been witness to the innovation and best practices that he brings into everybody that he works with at corrections. He is a certified corrections executive, as well as has expertise in accreditation and public safety training. Excited to have both of you with us here today. We're going to jump into it, folks. We are here to talk about resiliency in corrections, but we actually want to start. We've got a survey that just popped up for you all. Let's start with why we need resiliency in corrections. What are the biggest risks of working in corrections today? If you want to take a moment, folks, on your screen, there's a survey that has just popped up. We would love to hear from you. We're going to pivot to our invited speakers here in a minute and get their thoughts about what are the biggest risks of working in corrections today. But would love to hear from those of you who have logged on in the webinar. You can hover over the poll and submit your responses. So some of the risks that we have listed there are what we might call occupational risks, like exposure. We also have some risks there that are more organizational, such as impact on emotional health. So I see we've got some people. The answers are starting to trickle in there around the percentage of attendees. If you get a moment, we are going to be talking about resiliency in corrections and the role of active bystandership, but we wanted to level set and hear from you all about what are the biggest risks of working in corrections today. So I'm just going to give it another moment or two. We've tipped over to over 50% of people who have responded. We'd love to make sure we get an opportunity to hear from as many of you as possible. And there we are. Okay, so folks, you can see there, we've got, looks like our number one, the leaderboard, is impact of shift work, followed by exposure to primary and secondary trauma, threats and assaults on staff. Okay, thank you very much. We really appreciate your feedback on that. So I'd actually like to pivot now to our guest speakers. So Chris, I'd love to start with you if I may. You know, we saw some of the answers there from our audience and participants. I'm curious for you, what is a risk or a stressor that you had prepared yourself for when you started your career in corrections, and how does that change to what you see now as a significant risk in corrections today?
You know, for me, I think maybe I look at things maybe in a little bit more of a global perspective, but I know coming into corrections, you know, maybe not a risk as much as a fear, was just the fear of the unknown. So I had no clue what to expect. I came up in a system where you go to the academy first. So there was stress just, having to think about what the training was going to be like. I had never, although I grew up as a military brat, never really had any experience with any type of paramilitary organization from a work perspective. So that was definitely a stress for me, just figuring out how I was going to be able to navigate that. I think now though, I think that aligns with some of what I still see is there's just this fear of the unknown. I mean, as you work on the job, right, you definitely consider things like exposure to some type of communicable disease. I remember constantly, it was year after year, it was get your flu shots, and then it was MRSA. There's this fear of MRSA. There was HIV. There was avian flu that we were talking about. And then you had COVID, and it's like every couple of years, it's like there's this new disease. Am I going to get a TB? Is always one of those. Obviously the sensationalized versions of what you see on television as a reference point, although not always accurate and fair to our profession. The fear of being assaulted, the fear of somebody throwing urine or feces at you. I mean, all of those things sort of swirl around in your mind. And really now, I don't know that that's much changed. I think as you work in the profession longer, you're better prepared as to how to handle that in those situations. But I think all of those were things that were definitely weighing on my mind as stressors, coming into the job.
Thank you. Yeah, I know for myself, I can remember my first experience working in a jail of being exposed to TB. And most of us remember that first time. So Kathy, I'd love to pivot over to you, and I'd love to hear from you. What does the general public get wrong about the risks of working in corrections versus kind of what's the reality?
I can remember when I first started, one of the persons that went to college with me said, well, why do you care? Why do you want to waste your education working in a prison? And so I think the first thing that happens is, particularly for women, that goes to the physical violence. The second thing, and most important, I wanted to kind of talk about, and I knew this from early on, was that the job we do in corrections is not important or does not have a direct impact on public safety. So I feel like that is something that when you get into the job, you don't realize what a huge impact you can have. And so people who stay in the job tend to internalize this to the point that it really is a lifestyle. What we do is so important. We have so much time with the people we serve, and anybody who stays in it and runs into a person, an incarcerated person that's been freed, that you've had contact with, and all they want to do is introduce you to their family or tell you about the job that they have and thank you for what you did. And it can be the most minor of things. That is so important, and we need to be better educators of the fact that what we do here in corrections is so important to public safety in the communities that we'd like to see and live in. We have forgotten that, and we've forgotten to we're a central part of public safety. And the fact of the matter is that most people can be corrected to the point that they are no longer a risk to us. And it is up to people who serve in the field to really internalize that, but then to educate people and spend the time that it takes it's not an impossible job. It's just an ever-changing job that you have to be flexible for. And that's why it's so important.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think one of the things we often hear from folks working in corrections is not feeling like they're recognized for their role in public safety. And you mentioned having that experience of, interacting with people in the community who were formerly incarcerated. And I mean, isn't that, the ideal is to be thanked, right, for their role in their own recovery. And we would love everybody working in corrections to have that experience. Because one of the things I hear you saying, but I want to make sure I get it right, is one of the risks in correction is missing out on the opportunity that we have to be part of the recovery of the people we work with every single day.
Yeah, when we do our job right in correction, worse things don't happen. People do not recidivate in jails and prison. They recidivate in communities, and we're a part of that community. We're not islands out there. That our work affects real life situation, and we need to remind ourselves of the importance of that, and we need to remind people that don't know that of how important it is for us to have people devoted to this field.
Yeah, and to have, I couldn't agree more. You and I both, and I know Chris feels this way as well, we all really embody that both and, right? We want solutions that both elevate the people working in corrections and incarcerated persons and the communities to which they return. And it's a falsity to think that you have to be an either or. This is, you don't have to pick a camp. You can actually elevate all of them. But you said something that's really important is, being dedicated. We need a resilient workforce in order to do that hard work. It's not easy. In fact, Chris, you and I had a conversation last week about how there's nothing about this work that's easy, but what are some solutions that we have to do that? And so talking a little bit, moving from kind of what are the risks and the potential harms, one of the things that we know that will build, more resiliency in our correctional workforce is being able to prevent mistakes and prevent misconduct, right? We are all human beings. We all make mistakes. We all can fall prey to the harms of this job. So I'm gonna start with you, Kathy, and then Chris, I'd like to come over to you, which is, what are the harms? What are the mistakes? What are those misconducts that are, Kathy, for you, I guess my question is, what are the ones that are most often in corrections witnessed by their peers? So these are the not positive moments, right? But they're most often witnessed by their peers working in corrections. What comes to mind for you?
I think losing patience is a big one, because everything we do, it's so important for us to communicate effectively, particularly with people who are not at their best. This can be in person with our incarcerated population, but it can also be their families that we deal with, the victims in some cases. We have got to really understand that we can't lose our patience and become unprofessional, because while that might be one of 100 calls we get a day, that person who's calling us or that person who needs us needs a whole healthy person to answer that question, so we can de-escalate a situation, but prevent further harm from someone lashing out or continuing this dialogue if it's with the public that we are non-professionals. That's very, very hard, especially when a lot of people want to take out what they hate about the whole system on us, because we're the ones available always. We're the ones that spend the most time in the situation when things don't go through the court because of backlogs, when there's not enough hospital beds and we're waiting for a psychological evaluation. We are dealing with those folks, and we are dealing with our folks who deal with those folks. And so, again, I know it's not glamorous or real sexy, but keeping in mind that you're going to be harmed. People are going to talk to you badly, but you've got to understand what your role in that and how you can help, and to constantly, I myself struggle with losing patience, and I always feel bad when I do and have to apologize after, but you need to do that. You're a human being first, and that's okay. It's okay to make mistakes, but just remember that you're dealing with other people, and we need to be very flexible to be effective.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's important to remember, right? We are all human. We all lose our patience at some point, but I appreciate the acknowledgement that losing our patience is this category of risk where mistakes can happen. And something we talk a lot about in Heroes is this interrelationship between health and wellness of the correctional workforce. And when that's not at its best, we're more likely to lose our patience and make mistakes. And when you start to get a pattern of that, there is this risk of misconduct that it becomes a risk factor, right? And in fact, I was talking to a friend of mine who works in IA in corrections, and he just shared with me again, It's really rare that I'm looking at a case where it looked as if it was intentional. What it looked was a slope, right? It was a risky slope. And I think you're right that losing our patients is a really common one, and specifically one that is often witnessed by peers. I know you, Kathy, you're a very high integrity person, and I heard you name, when I lose my patients, I have to apologize. And I think the thing we want to start inserting with active bystandership is if Kathy's losing her patients, how does Abigail, who works with Kathy every single day, and I know your true values, how do you and I work out a language so that I can intervene and keep that patients from shifting down that slippery slope for sure? And I'm curious. Oh, go ahead, Kathy.
No, just real quick. I think that's important to also remember. We're always on display to the MA population, and working together shows human interactions that are real, right? Keep it real. If you make a mistake, for them to hear you say, I'm going to take a step back, because for them to see resilience as well, coming together of two people, regardless of the rank, I think is so very important, because our job is to demonstrate correct behavior and correct responses when all is not lost, right? And I think that's so very, very important to be in that position to show that you're a real person and show what happens to real people who don't respond violently to compose themselves.
Well stated. I couldn't agree more. And Chris, I'm curious for you, from your experience, what are some common harms that occur in corrections that are very commonly witnessed by their peers?
When I think about that and just listening to the conversation, I think sometimes when we think of harms, we all sort of go to that worst case scenario, right? We think of our worst incidents, where there's, a use of force situation that went bad, or, somebody's treating somebody poorly. And one of the things that I'm trying to refocus our team on is, harms aren't always noticeable, right? That, a lot of this stuff, the basic policies and procedures that we have in place, if not followed, cause harm, right? And so, and I know, Abigail, we talked about a situation that we had last week in our facility, and sometimes it might not be noticeable that somebody's not doing, the appropriate amount of, security rounds or something like that, and that gets looked over, but then that can escalate to be a larger harm, for the department, or for an individual. So for me, I think, obviously the losing composure, people getting short with individuals, people, talking disrespectfully, but I would say in my career, sometimes you see these things that are based off of just people not following the policy and procedure, and then those turn into, larger harms. And I don't know if I answered that question, but I wanted to make that point, as far as what these harms might actually be, inside the facilities.
That's helpful. And I guess if I could build off of that, building off of that, Chris, there was something that happened right recently in your facility. I'm curious if you're, comfortable just sharing. You certainly don't need the details, but, what are those concentric circles of harm? You mentioned sometimes it's not obvious, right? But what are those concentric circles of harm when we miss the opportunity to intervene?
I think that they, they build on each other, right? That, one thing that is done incorrectly that causes a harm that then leads to a larger issue that then, potentially leads to something catastrophic. It's a weird phenomenon to me. I tell academy classes, if you make a mistake, own the mistake. And, it's correctable. And there are some mistakes that, might not be correctable, depending on how bad they are. But generally speaking, most mistakes are correctable if we know about it and, we can address it and, create a path forward to retrain or, figure out, how to solve the problem. For some reason, and I don't fully understand it, people sometimes double down on their mistakes and then just, dig themselves deeper and deeper and deeper and think that, the true information's not going to come to light. And I mean, any of us working in corrections, the walls have ears, everything, it's only a matter of time before it gets, even me at, the highest level as a superintendent, my staff are amazed at how I know and, have knowledge of the things I do. And it's simply because I walk around the facility. Sometimes I'll walk around the facility for 2 hours before I ever get to my office. And by the time the warden comes to report, what happened the day before, I know everything. And he's like, I don't understand how you, figured all this out. But so doubling down on a mistake just is not good practice. I know it seems difficult to tell on yourself, but it's so much easier. I think the outcomes are so much better when you take ownership. And I think that, active bystandership, is really not only people taking accountability for themselves, but then also furthering that, to help other people be accountable for themselves. And, that's what we've tried to do is foster that, that culture in our facilities. And I'll say it's not me. We had a strong culture when we got here. This is just a further progression of how we build on that. And, I think that we're seeing the results of that information, investigations seem to be a lot cleaner. The information comes out, staff are taking accountability for their actions. One of the statistics I look at is, grievances and staff discipline. I can tell you, I haven't had a staff grievance since last July, and I have multiple unions at my facility. Our discipline process is a 2-phase process where there's a recommendation and then that recommendation comes to me for discipline. Most cases of late that we've had, they agree at the first level to accept the discipline and accept accountability. And those are things that we're seeing as a result of, the culture change and the HEROES program at our facility.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think there's a couple of nuggets in there. First, pro tip, correctional leaders, when you get it to work, before you go to your office and check your email, walk around the facility, right? Talk to your staff, talk to the incarcerated persons, walk around. So excellent pro tip to be sharing there, Chris. Thank you. The other thing that I heard is that, I remember the conversation you and I were having was, you all rolled out HEROES active bystandership training to the whole staff. But what I remember you and I talking about is that now the work begins to build a culture that prevents harm. And it's not always clear cut, but you're seeing it in the outcomes, right? You're seeing it in those reduced grievances, in those in the taking the first as opposed to going to the second level of discipline and building that culture. And we like to talk about it as building a culture that prevents harm, but also is permission to intervene. And I want to highlight something that one of my mentors and HEROES co-founder, Dr. Joel Duboskin, often says, which is, you're right? Culture is built from the ground up, and leaders can accept that culture, but man, Joel would also say, but leaders can kill it too. So you may have walked into a solid culture, but you kept it going by saying, and we're going to keep elevating and we're going to keep doing professional development and stay on the innovative path. So I think there's a lot to be said for that, right? We don't reach a check mark of we're good, right? We don't need to keep training. We don't need to do anything. We have to keep evolving. And I think that's huge what you reflected on, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just share real quick if I could cut in. I don't know if it was, luck or whatever, the stars aligned, but I remember telling you, we had an incident at our facility. I think it was the week, we were talking about HEROES. We had gotten the message out to the unions. We told them, this is in our training plan next year. This is what we want to do. We actually had an incident where a staff member intervened. And when we got to the discipline process, our union leadership that were representing that employee said, so this is probably what that training is about. And we talked about that, and that was that just worked because that established that, staff can help and that can mitigate, something getting way worse than it needed to be, but that everybody, has that opportunity to help each other out. And we sort of went from there. And I mean, that was just a perfect catalyst for launching training. Even off of a bad incident, there was still a positive discussion around, how we can use that to help our department. So, yeah, absolutely.
I love that. And something we often talk about is that, there's no wrong time to start reflecting, doing differently, and intervening. So even if it is after the event, there's an opportunity there to learn. And then how do you prevent that from happening and forward? And I love to hear that. I think you engaging your union early is a big part of the successful adoption of active bystandership training and the culture shift. And we have another client that, we met with the union early on, and their feedback will, of course, this is something that's good for our members, but it's that holistic good. And I think the other piece that you highlighted there is that it's not, active bystandership isn't an equal sign to some bulletproof magic, right? Where harm never happens. It's starting to step outside and say, okay, when we're talking about mistakes also can be not intervening, right? And I'm curious, either one of you, do either of you have an example in your career that you look back and you say, yeah, I witnessed this, right? I witnessed this harm and I did not intervene. And, does that still sit with you today? Because those are a different kind of mistake. And those are the mistakes that we're hoping active bystandership can really, make a difference on.
Absolutely. I have a little bit of a different take on this. We had a situation where one of our captains was actually killed in a hostage situation. There were people that responded to that event that probably did not need to respond, but were there. I took a subordinate with me. That subordinate probably, I know now, definitely was not prepared to witness it, nor was I. And that's part of the reason that I invited her to come. So what happened in that situation, she was a classification officer, I should start with that. And so she had made a decision to make some people trustees, and they were engaged in the actual event. That's something that, you're never prepared for. We had not had an employee killed for several decades. And what happened after that was, I don't think I checked in on her enough after that. She is not working in this field anymore. It haunts me to this day that was probably, something that, number one, as her supervisor, I should have been more thoughtful about what we needed to do to talk through that. But at the time, everybody was like, this has happened and we're strong and tough and can do this. But it's not, and it was not something that even, it's a secondary, I guess, response to something, the major event, in that we responded to the situation, the secondary event in that we need to make sure each other are well. After that happened, several years later, we had an employee who committed suicide during lunch. I worked at a very large prison, and we had a large employee residential area on the grounds. And so what happened as a result of the prior incident with the hostage situation is I could have gone into that area to see, and a lot of my peers did go in, but I knew that I was not needed to do that, and I stayed back. And as a result of that, while they struggled, I think, with dealing with what they saw, and it was particularly brutal, I was able to help some of the people who responded later, and I was also able to maintain order because they were engaged in that, and then had to, that was a really long period of time where people were just not whole after that. It's not something, like I said, that you're prepared to see, because despite what the public thinks that it's the physical violence, it's not. And so when you have the physical violence, it's shocking, and we need to be real about that.
Yeah, I agree. When we're talking about those missed moments to intervene, we can talk about the mistakes that you might make. I think about mistakes I made when I first started working in a jail. I made a ton of them. I didn't know what I was doing. And I think about, where was there a witness? And when somebody equally started in the jail and they were making mistakes, I now know, looking back, I could have taken more action to intervene and say, hey, that's not how we do it. Let me show you how, right? But I miss those moments. Then there's those misconducts. I think you and Chris both said, there's a lot of fanfare for that. But Kathy, you're really highlighting that one of the other harms that we see that often there are missed moments is death by suicide, and really that emotional trauma. And that when we are witness to our peers in corrections and their deteriorating health and wellness, you don't have to be a licensed mental health professional. You don't have to be on the peer support team to recognize that deterioration in health and intervene to say, hey, let's get you. Because what you're also sharing is, because when we don't, here's the outcomes, right? When you said, like, people are not whole after that, right? Like, there's an outcome to that person that we lost, their family, everybody was impacted that day. And so I think one of the things for folks listening on that I would encourage you to do is to reflect on times in your career where you were witness to harm, whether that was a mistake, misconduct, or the deteriorating health and wellness of the people you work with. And that reflection is not to bring up feelings of guilt or to imply shame. It's to have us to start thinking about where could we have intervened so that we can shift more to that resilient culture. Because I align with Kathy in that the death by suicide rate in corrections is unacceptable. And we've got to do something about it because we're not going to get to the goals that we want without everybody. We need to bring everybody to the table. I do want to take a quick moment. We've been talking about active bystandership a little bit here. I'd like to bring a definition in from Dr. Irvin Staub. He's a world-renowned researcher on active bystandership, but starting with his definition of what is a bystander. Somebody who's in a position to know that there is the need for positive action and is in a position to take some form of action. And I'm going to just briefly use Kathy's example earlier about losing patience, right? So if I'm working side by side with Kathy, we work every single day, and I know her values, right, and what she wants to have at work. If I see her losing her patience with an incarcerated person, I am witness to it. I'm in a position to know that if this could go real bad, if it keeps going, right, I'm in a position to know that. And I'm in a position to do something about it. I'm right there and witness to it. At that moment in time, if Kathy is losing her patience, she's not in her best self. I, one step next to the witness, can be. I think that helps us further understand that when we have those options where we're witnessing people losing their patience, not their best selves, making mistakes, potentially engaging in something that might look like misconduct, or their health and wellness is deteriorating, we have a choice. We can be passive bystanders who do not intervene. And there's two risks there. Risk number one is that the harm continues. And risk number two is that we might actually communicate that we're okay with that harm. That's the real double down, right? We see bad things happening. We don't do anything about it. And then it potentially communicates to other people that we're okay with it. Or we can be active bystanders. And these folks step in. And as we've talked about earlier, it's not perfect, but it allows us the opportunity to reduce the risk of harm and to really name, hey, this thing here that we're all seeing, it's just not okay, right? And those are those options. And, quick throw out to our members right now, or sorry, the people focusing in on the webinar, I encourage you to think about the catchphrases that you say in your workplace that falsely communicate that there's a place of neutral. Because if you're looking at the visual right now, there is no neutral. When it comes to bystanders, you are either passive or active. And I know one that I have used in my career, and I now know that it falsely communicates neutral, is above my pay grade. Like, that's one of those phrases that people say that, oh yeah, I see the harm, I'm not going to do anything about it. We want to pretend that we're just being neutral, right? Oh, that's above my pay grade. But truth, folks, is that is a form of passive bystandership, right? We're witnessing the harm and we're not doing anything about it. And it's tough stuff, but we know that training gives us a shared language and skills that we can become active bystanders. But that also moves us into, taking those skills and putting them in action. And Chris, I want to return back to you. So you all have done active bystandership training, top down, bottom up, inside out. It's now in your academy. I'm curious if you have any examples of sort of it being in action, right? And it not necessarily, maybe it's an intervention, or maybe it's just how your staff and your workforce talk about this training. What does it mean to them in action?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely fully implemented. I'm going to hop back maybe to a comment before, but I had an example just sort of right in my face last week where I was walking around talking to staff, and generally it's how are you doing, and you normally expect I'm doing okay, things are good, that type of communication, and somebody said I'm not doing really well, and it took me aback for a second. I said, well, hey, what's going on? And we went outside and had a discussion. And unfortunately, one of my staff members had recently lost, he had just gotten off the phone, received a call that his brother had passed away. And so, I talked to him for a little bit, checked that he was okay to drive, had a conversation with him, and texted him over the weekend just to check on him. And one of the things he said is, I'm not really an open person, but I felt comfortable, having that conversation with you. And maybe it was just the time. Maybe it's because I communicate with the staff and, try and have a good relationship with them. But that was one of those moments where, like you said, you could choose, to really hear somebody, or you could just choose to say things and not really worry about the response that's coming back. I think that's sort of that active listening, component. And I know I keep bouncing off of what your questions are, but I think for me, one of the things that we did a post-training survey, and I vividly remember one of the comments from a staff member was, I always thought I was being difficult, but now I realize I was an active bystander. And that really hit it, and I know our training director, Sheris, I don't think she could have waited 5 minutes to send that to me and say, I think we're making a change. I think we're having an impact. But I continue to see, staff, check in on individuals. And I mean, we have, on the wellness side, we have a lot of components, in our system. I actually just added a new member to our critical incident stress management team the other day. And even just the people responding to that, right, shows that, the staff care about the resource that we're providing, or that they respect, the individual, that's going to be part of that team that, could potentially, have some difficult, conversations with the staff. So we just see these little snippets. You're right. It's not a one stroke, across the board, like you're going to see it, or that you're ever going to be fully there. But I always look for like you said, those little nuggets that show that we're doing the right thing, that staff are responding. Like I said, whether it's in our grievances, or whether it's in our discipline, or whether it's in, our labor management meetings. When I came to the county, I was told that the relationships between the unions and the leadership was non-existent. They were not talking to each other. 4 years in at the facility, I actually look forward to the meetings, right? And half the time it's just a conversation, because we're already openly communicating on the issues that we need to be talking about on a regular basis. So those are things that are really gauging, how we perform. But it's all premised on, caring about your staff, caring about your people, caring about each other. We just came off of National Correctional Employees and Officers Week, and we're doing cookouts. And even though we recognize each other, all the time, and that's a special week, but we continue to maintain that culture of looking out for people. So those are some examples there.
That's fantastic. And yeah, first shout out to, yes, your training director, Sheris Mundell. She is dynamite. Everybody at Anne Arundel is lucky to have her passion for bringing high quality training to the folks who work there. And thank you for sharing that nugget from the post survey that somebody stated that, I thought I was being difficult, but now I know I was being an active bystander. And I got goosebumps, and I'm hopeful. I'm guessing that there are people on the webinar today who can relate to that feeling. Man, I always felt like I was being difficult. I was getting this flack, but how are what we're trying to do with an active bystandership culture, starting with the training, is shift to a new culture that says, no, that's being a courageous, moral courage, active bystander. So that's a huge shift. I couldn't agree more. And I think something else you're highlighting on is that when we talk about active bystandership and action, it's important to understand why we're doing it. And it's because we care. We care about the outcomes. We care about the people who are in custody, and we care about our workforce. I know that Karen Collins-Rice, another co-founder of Heroes, she really talks about how, that the secret sauce behind effective leadership in corrections is emotional intelligence. And you're really, modeling and talking about that, Chris, whether it's working with unions or whether it's working for your staff. And I think that's something really important to keep in mind, is that one of the ways that we talk about active bystandership is using the example you just shared. As we say, if you're going to ask somebody, are you okay? Be prepared to hear news that is not positive. Be prepared to listen. Be prepared to take action on that. And that's how we really move things forward. And I'm curious, Chris, while I've got you, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Kathy, is that, so we've talked about active bystandership, what it is, given some examples in action. The thing about it, though, is that, and I've talked to both of you about this extensively, it's easier said than done. It's not a slogan. It's not something you just, it's not a certificate that you just put and then you're good to go. It takes practice. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing with me, Chris, maybe one or two examples about, specifically in corrections, why is it hard to intervene?
I mean, I think you sort of touched on it earlier, that there's this, this mentality or this thought that it's an us versus them type of, environment. Coming up in law enforcement, you hear about the thin blue line and, stick with your, your brotherhood, whatever the terminology is. But I think that, there are obviously some other, rank structure, position. Some of it, to me, when I think about that, is just, do you really know what you're seeing, right? Are you truly recognizing, that this is a harm? And then, a lot of times staff are unsure. What is the policy and procedure? I remember early in my career, conducting a strip search, and the strip search policy, for those that have done them, is very specific. You start at the top of the head and fingers through the hair and, fold back the ears and open the mouth and eyes and nose, and you work your way down, and, after removing all of the clothing and handing it over. And what I saw were senior staff changing the order of the process. And they were changing the order of the process so that when people got to, I'm not trying to be vulgar, but, squatting and coughing and spreading their butt cheeks, that then they were having them go back and, open up, have them put their hands in their mouth and open up their mouth and go. And it didn't dawn on me at the time, early in my career, that they were doing that to degrade and disrespect the population, or there would be some comment, afterward about, that process. But watching it happen in real time as a new officer, I wouldn't have picked up on it because I wasn't as versed in the policy and procedure. As I, moved throughout my career, then it's like, okay, now I see what they're doing, that this is this little bit of power that they can have over this population, which then, creates that, dynamic where it is in us, you create this us and them. So it doesn't have to be like that. I think you guys talked about it, and I said it in my county council meeting the other day for my budget presentation. Our population in the jail is our community. People do not maybe think of it that way. It's a community that's maybe, in a temporary living situation for whatever reason. Most cases, they're returning to our community. While they're there, they are still our community. And we need to figure out how to treat them as such. There are a lot of things, that we have to juggle and manage, when you're managing that entire population, that maybe the living conditions aren't, as, similar to the community, or maybe there are controls that we have on food and shower and things of those nature, but they're still our community. So
Yeah.
the more we figure out how to treat them and treat them that way, that I think the better it is. But I think those are some of the challenges. Just you're not sure. There's sort of a rank dynamic that sometimes come into play, and then you feel like you're in a position to have allegiance to one side or the other when it doesn't have to be that way. And the reality is, sometimes when you intervene, you actually are protecting, the individuals that work alongside you, and they might not realize it at the time. But in some cases, when I look at some of the discipline cases that we've had before, most cases they're thankful that somebody was able to step in at certain points, because like I said, things escalate really fast in a correctional setting, and normally when things escalate, there are poor outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would agree. And I when we reflect on why it's hard to intervene, it kind of highlights why we need to have training, right? It's not just a policy mandate, hey, make duty to intervene, that we really need to train in this perishable skill, because it is easier said than done. A couple other reasons that we've got a lot of social science, including from Darley and Latané, New York University, really talks about how there's this effect when there's other people around, that sometimes we don't intervene because there just happen to be other people around. And one of the things you mentioned, Chris, that I fall prey to is called pluralistic ignorance, which is, well, what if I'm wrong? Maybe everybody else seems to know what they're doing. I must be the one that's incorrect, right? So then I don't intervene. I'm curious, Kathy, if you have any examples or other thoughts about why is it hard to intervene in corrections when we see harm occurring?
I think it's confidence and competency. There are these incidents that happen, but you got to understand and know, particularly as a leader, that there's no time wasted in our field in terms of educating our staff to stand up when those things happen. And so I think it's about trust. It's about, we toss around micromanaging, but to be real, another comment that said that breeds passiveness is this thought that, well, I can do it better all by myself. We don't work in a world that's all by itself anymore. It is so I make my people work together in pairs. And it was amazing to me, because I thought, I'd love to have somebody working alongside of me. And what happened was we had a lot of staff that didn't want to work with anybody. They didn't want somebody there with them. But it's such a better officer presence. All the females in our field, they can learn from their male counterparts to kind of bridge over that information sharing. But as a leader, giving them the opportunity and reissuing that every day we can educate people, and they can use that information not only inside but outside, and it makes us all safer. I used to think that when I left the prison or the jail that I could put my guard down and just, I'm off of work. And correctional officers and professionals are really endangered species. So we need to take care of them. They're our greatest resources in this fight to preserve our freedom in our communities and our safety. And so trust that what you're doing and the time that you're taking. And I appreciate Heroes because you created something just for us. And I think that's very important in the morale of our staff, but also to give them the confidence to know that, hey, this is an important job. And I've been given these extra tools now to not only take care of myself, but to go ahead and do my job very competently. And that goes with the confidence.
Well, thank you. And we did, in fact, I'm going to put up another poll, folks. We'd like to hear from you about what are the biggest challenges in training in corrections. And while your folks are taking a minute to look at that poll, just to review, double down on what Kathy stated, we did create this for corrections. And I love that, this endangered species. We want to be a part of bringing it back to its full luster and glory. And you also stated, Kathy, that confidence and competencies are a big part in working together. And we believe that training is a big part of that. And that's why we'd love your feedback, folks, on what are the biggest challenges in training, because, you know, training should not be a policy mandate. It shouldn't be boring. It shouldn't be, you know, lack of interaction. So we would love to hear from you. What are the things that are challenges in training? Because as Kathy stated, we are, you know, designed by corrections for corrections. We want to continue hear from the correctional world, you know, what is something about corrections training that is not going well. So let's take a look here. Looks like the number one is lack of engagement. There's not active learning and a reduced funding or focus on training. And we couldn't agree more about that. And so appreciate people's feedback. Oopsie, sorry about that. That was my bad. So one of the things we just want to highlight, folks, is that, you know, we've talked a lot about training, and we know that it should be high quality, designed for corrections, and that we know that it should engage people's brains. You know, Kathy, you said it is for corrections, and we want to elevate the professional development of people working in corrections so that they have an opportunity to bring their best selves to the calling of their work, right? To public safety, but also so that they go home safe, right? We want people to go home safe and end happy, healthy careers. And we know that that begins when people have this opportunity to create a culture, you know, where they can really put trust. You mentioned this, Kathy, right? We want to put trust. How do we put trust? But, you know, pulling together your element of trust and Chris, your element around how do we intervene? We just want folks to know that we invite you. We're going to jump to Q&A here, and just one last invitation. We invite folks to train with us. I believe that Anne Arundel County is a gold star for how to implement training as a whole department and a whole agency, and then move to the culture. But it doesn't always have to be that way. You, as an individual, can attend a one-day training and walk away with skills to bring your moral courage in line with the skills to intervene effectively when you see harm. And with that, I am going to hand it back over to Steve, and we're going to get to some Q&A.
Okay, great. Yes, everybody, it is time for the Q&A portion of the webinar, so please send in those questions. And let's get to it right here. First one for you, panel. What can you do if an employee doesn't want to share their problems with you? And this is in regards to preventing suicide.
I can answer that. Corrections, don't forget that we're made of many, many people and many experiences. And so never stop looking for the person to provide that peer support, and just always let people know when they're ready, you're always available. But never forget that there's so many of us that come into corrections with our life experiences. And that's the one beautiful thing about corrections. We touch upon everything. I'm often in groups of people from various backgrounds, and I always find something that corrections in my career has allowed me to understand and see very different perspectives. So they may not want to talk to you or share right now and then, but always make that open, and, you know, be brave and out front about it, that's cool here. It's cool to be a bystander here. It's cool to talk about your feelings. It's cool to feel low sometimes, because the weight of what we do is so important and really heavy. So.
Yeah, the other thing just to add to that is share that information, right? If you think and see somebody struggling and you can't get through to them, that doesn't mean that you can't go to somebody else and share it, so that you're not, you know, if God forbid, if something happens, you're not carrying around that you didn't do anything, right? So you can also be active by, you know, helping, you know, move it up the chain, so that if somebody's truly in need of help, that they can get a resource or, you know, somebody to be able to talk to them.
Okay. Let's move on to the next question here. Why are body-worn cameras or eyes in the sky not enough?
I'll take a first stab real quick, but it's a lot of that technology, you know, you're going back and you're reviewing things, right? And it's after the fact, right? And so when something is actually happening, that's the time. Those are great for, after action reviews and writing reports and, seeing the full accounts of what actually happened, in real time versus how you remember it when you're documenting it. All, they definitely have their place, but, what we see is you don't have somebody watching it real time, right? And when you're engaged in real time, that's when you need to be engaged. And if you're working with somebody, don't go back to wait to see what happened, with an individual watching it on the body cam footage or, pulling it off of I'll date myself and say the DVR there, review it in real time, take action in real time.
Yeah, technology does not replace humanity. I mean, vendors of technology would not like me to say this, but we really need to boil it down to sometimes we're not going to have those tools. And people, quite frankly, as a person who had a camera follow me for many, many months, 24/7, you get used to it and you forget. You're more concentrated on what's, this tool rather than how you're internalizing as a person what you're doing and the importance. So it's always, I think one of the problems we have today is we're used to talking into a black screen rather than talking to each other face to face. And I think that's why it's not enough.
Okay. Next question here. Why should leaders invest in training for a standard policy, in this case, duty to intervene?
There's never can be enough reiteration of why that's so important. You can just look at the lawsuits and the things people are losing their career because they don't know how to handle force. Just because you're trained to intervene in a certain way, you always have to be reminded of the things that other people are learning so you don't make those same mistakes, so that you can have lessons learned about when or not, if it's the right time. And that's why it's so wonderful to have another person there by you to learn how to work together so that you're not putting your careers at risk, and also that you're responding in a way that's not going to cause physical or emotional harm.
Yeah, and I just say that, our business is rooted in policy and procedure, and that sets the expectation. That way everybody knows, what page you're operating off of. I mean, people are going to do things at different skill levels, and that's okay. But, you have to set the expectation.
Okay.
And Steve, if I could comment on that as well, because there's a comment in the chat that I think relates to that, is that, if policy mandates were enough to change human behavior, we wouldn't be in the mess that we are in right now. And anybody knows this from humans. Just telling somebody to do something or not do something does not mean that they will do it or not do it. And when it comes to active bystandership, it's a perishable skill. Great news, it means you can learn it and you can practice it and get really good at it. But the bad news means if you're not getting trained in it and you're not practicing it on the regular, it's going to get stale, just like all your other perishable skills, and could really put you at risk.
Okay.
If I could just make a comment about that also, when you're training, you need to listen, because that's when you enhance your policies, because the people that you're training are the people that are actually going to practice that policy. And so I just, you need to be bold sometimes. This might be the standard right now, but who's to say that what you're experiencing at your facility is not the standard that will be there in the future? And if it makes sense to our employees, they will carry out that policy and procedure through the practice. So many times it's the practice that goes wrong, not the policy or procedure.
Okay. Time for another quick one here. How does focusing on officer and employee wellness reduce misconduct?
I mean, for me, it shows that you care. And if you show that you care about people, they're gonna perform. I think they're just gonna perform better. They're gonna be invested. And that's what we want. We want people that are invested in our profession, invested in doing the right thing. And that's a partnership. And I think things go bad when, the staff don't feel supported, whether it's by each other or by administration. And so, it starts with caring. And I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Chris more on that.
Okay. Well, panel, unfortunately, we're out of time here for today's presentation, but I want to thank you all for joining us today. So thanks so much for being here. Kathy, Abigail, and Chris, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thanks also to our sponsors for today's webinar, Heroes. We appreciate their sponsorship of today's webinar. And unfortunately, we're out of time here, everybody. We've got to wrap up. But everyone have a great rest of your day and stay safe. Take care now.